Welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast. This is Rika Patterson, head women's basketball coach at Southeast Missouri State University. I believe a leader should model the behavior and habits that we expect from our staff and team. Excellence, work ethic, grace, forgiveness, and love. We play the SEMO way, extremely hard, extremely tough, and together, because this gives us the best chance to achieve our goals that we have control over. The NCAA Leadership Development Program taught me many different things as an intern, work habits, and athletic professionalism. The ACE program taught me how to ace the interview, preparation, delivery, and messaging. Enjoy the episode.
Greetings, this is Ty Brown, and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast, where we highlight executive and organizational leadership. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at 1Q Leadership. Our guest today is Garry Rosenfield. Garry is an attorney and coaches agent with Coaches Inc. Greetings, Garry. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Now, what I understand about your background is that when you finished law school, you wrapped law school, and within a few months, you had your first client as a coaches agent.
Yeah. I graduated from Quinnipiac School of Law in 2013, took the Mass Bar exam, and then moved down to Washington, D.C. to start working with Coaches Inc., a group that I'm still with today. At the time, Coaches Inc. was representing football and men's basketball coaches, and I saw an opportunity to work with and assist women's basketball coaches. So moved down to DC to start doing that. The first few months was really just research based on my end, talking to as many people as I could. Not being a coach myself, felt like there was a lot to learn in the space. So talked to as many people as possible, and then started reaching out to coaches in November and signed my first client, I believe, in December of 2013.
Which is excellent. What I heard in there, it sounds like to me, is you started the women's basketball division for Coaches Inc. Yeah?
Yeah.
And we're talking about 11 years later now. Yeah. Are you still the only women's basketball person in Coaches Inc., or has it expanded?
Yeah. Within our group, I am. I kind of lead everything we do related to women's sports for the most part. There's certainly now a number of other people in the space of women's basketball that do what I do. But in terms of like the group that I work with, it's me.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. And then recently you've gotten into women's volleyball in terms of representing coaches. One thing I've heard athletic directors say in the past, and I want you to educate me on this.
Sure.
Is, they say, man, I don't want to deal with an agent. Like, let me talk directly to the coach. I've heard that a couple times. And, I almost don't understand. It's like, well, I mean, you have an agent as an AD.
A lot of them do.
Right, a lot of people do, right? Yeah. So you want somebody who is knowledgeable about putting together contracts, or knowledgeable on negotiating to make sure I get the best possible deal for me and basically the best possible deal for both parties in terms of representing me. So talk to me a little bit about that aspect. Do you find hesitation in working with agents, or where are you?
At this point, I really don't. It was something that I think early on in what I was doing, a lot of times it was more of a concern for the coach than the reality of it. I think at this point, for those of us in the space who have been doing it for a while, you have a reputation. You have people that can speak about the work that you do and what it's like to work with you. And what I've learned very quickly is that as big a world as it seems, this college athletic space, it's really incredibly small. Everybody is connected to somebody else. At this point, for me, I've probably worked with people who are now at the majority of the Division I schools, as crazy as that sounds, just with how people move and shake in the business. So, when a coach has that concern, I definitely talk with them about, what there may be to be worried about. And there are certainly instances where athletic directors have taken the approach of not wanting to talk to an agent. I think a lot of times it has more to do with the specific sport that they're talking about. But even in those instances where that's the case, we're able to provide our value regardless. If they feel like they need to work through the coach, we're happy to do that. They don't need to know that we're involved. But we're going to put our coach is in the best position possible to get what they're deserving of. And if that means that we have to take a behind the scenes position, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, that's excellent, right? If it's behind the scenes, you're still advice and counsel, so that I can.
Yeah, it's just it can be hard. It can be hard for the coach. Like my goal is that when I get involved, I want the coaches to be communicating with their athletic department about their program, right? Like, how do they make their program better? What can you give our program to have more success? And the conversations that I want to have are about that coach. So it's sometimes, tough or uncomfortable to then flip the switch and start advocating for yourself as opposed to your program. But, if there's no other way, then that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, I find that interesting, right? Even in interviews, I'm talking to people, whether it be ADs, assistant, senior associates, deputies, coaches, they do tend to talk about the program. And there are times when I'm like, I understand the program, but in 3 years, if we interview again, you may or may not be there. So let's talk about you and your leadership, right?
Sure.
So he's trying to get people to advocate for themselves, talk about themselves and the things they've done and accomplished, as opposed to just talking about the program, which is a good thing that they want to talk about the program because that's kind of who they are. But I find that interesting. I wonder how an agent evaluates themselves, right? Measure success. Is it just, we got these contracts done? Are you looking at numbers, or like, tell me about that aspect of the business?
Yeah. I mean, not to sound too cliche, but I think I probably evaluate the work that I do based on how my clients are feeling, about the positions that they're in and the service that they're getting. It's not, certainly we keep tabs of numbers in terms of clients, in terms of, dollar figures of contracts negotiated. But the way that I do what I do is that when I meet a coach, regardless of where they are at in their career, and we decide to work together, I want to work with them from the time that we start working together until the day they retire. So, I kind of see my value or measure my value in client retention. And also, my hope is that when you look at any coach that we work with, where were they when we started working together? And whether that's, position title, school, conference level, whatever it might be, or even just, earnings. And then if we're still working together today and or when they retire, were they in a better place than when we first met?
Right.
So it's not particularly objective. It's much more subjective, but I'm sure there are other people who do what I do that might value or judge their value or success differently. Maybe how many jobs their clients get. Maybe, that seems to be a big one. But, for me, it's more about the path and what we do along the way.
Yeah, which is interesting. Walk me through the process of business term, right? MBA, client acquisition. I mean, does most of it come through referrals? Do people call you out of the blue like, hey, I'm, these things are happening right now in my career and I feel like I probably should get somebody to help me through this? Or do you reach out? Like, tell me about the aspect.
Yeah, it's much different today, 10, 11 years later than it was at the beginning. Without me being a coach and having been in the business, the first few years was like I was the guy sending 400 emails, hoping to get responses. And I think my first month doing this, I think I sent 352 emails and got 3 responses.
Wow.
2 of which were no thank yous. And there was one who's my longest client today who was ready to go.
So it sounds like me applying to grad school. Like, Brad, what are we doing?
So, today I think it probably, there's very little reach out, working with the coaches that I work with. There are only so many people in the women's sports space doing what I do. And there are some heavy hitters for sure, who are not me. But I think at this point, if you're looking for an agent, you probably know a couple of names that you're either going to reach out to or you're going to ask your friends or your peers who they've used and what their experience have been.
Right.
So I'd say 95% of client acquisition today is word of mouth. And then, if I'm asked to head to a coaches convention and speak or meet with people, I guess that's not necessarily word of mouth, but it's also not, cold reaching out.
Yeah.
So it can vary, but for the most part, right, when we talk about how you measure success, when clients of mine are recommending me to others or saying, hey, I gave your name to so-and-so, it's a pretty good sales pitch.
Yeah. I mean, I tell you what I find interesting about what you said. And I guess in many businesses, this could be the, you want to reach a certain point. You start off, you cold calling, you're trying to sell your wares to people. You get a person, right? And you grow and grow and grow. And you want to get to a point to where when you go from hard selling to word of mouth, you've reached a point that I must be doing something right. And then if you're going to conventions or going to conferences or you're doing some public speaking, now the credibility is in the room before I'm there, right?
Sure.
And you're standing up doing this public speaking and people may have heard your name already or know the people that you already represent.
Sure.
So it's not even the sales, but I'm just educating the crowd on what the business is, and then people want to come up to you and talk to you or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's been, it's very smart of you to say. I mean, that's been a big part of whenever I speak, right? Depending on what the organization, or if a coach is bringing me in or an AD is bringing me in to speak, depending on what they want me to talk about, that's what I'll talk about. But, I've never, ever made it a sales pitch for Garry or for Coaches Inc. It's usually, hey, talk about a topic that you're pretty familiar with, and you're going to talk about why it's important and how to manage it and how to see it and how to deal with it. So could there naturally be somebody that's like, oh, I should be looking at this and I wonder who could help me do that? Of course. But I do think, especially in the women's sports space, the way that we've always talked about it is that, football will always set the standard for contracts and what's doable and what schools are willing to do. And then men's basketball seems to trail football by 3 to 5 years in terms of taking on those types of advancements with their contracts and their finances. And then women's basketball has trailed men's basketball by about 4 to 5 years in terms of that becoming outside of the outliers, right? In terms of that, being the norm from an administrator standpoint, being willing to do it. And I think, sports then trail women's basketball as you kind of go down, I don't want to say the list of sports.
Yeah. So then you move into volleyball.
Yeah.
And I heard you say before we started recording, there's not a corresponding men's sport.
Sure. Yeah.
So then how do you base, the contracts and stuff like that in volleyball? And let me give you some context in my brain and you'll educate me. The trend in volleyball is increasing. I mean, upwards, right? You talk about participation, you talk about attendance and viewership. And so when those numbers, specifically participation, so viewership and attendance is going up, and you got a steady feed of student athletes who are going to want to play, it looks positive. But I don't know if that translates because you don't have anything to base it off of, like you said, just how you just went through the lineage of contracts, right?
Sure.
So tell me about how you operate in the volleyball space.
Yeah, I mean, so, volleyball came about through speaking at coaches conferences. Kathy DeBoer, the former executive director of the AVCA, I got to know her when we were partnered with NACWA at the time, now Women Leaders in Sport. And, Kathy had this vision of where volleyball was going, which when she shared it with me, she's now absolutely correct in terms of where the sport was going, in terms of interest and attendance and growth. Now, the way it really shakes itself out is like, it's not a big part of what I do, but coaches reach out and they'll say, hey, can you help me with a contract here or there? And, it's really different than women's basketball. As you said, and you heard me say earlier, without a corresponding men's sport that's really being heavily invested in, volleyball in a lot of ways is on its own, trying to pull itself up. So, for me, it ultimately comes down, like any coach that I represent, it's about value and value add, and not just about, the value that I can add, but what is that coach and that program doing for that institution? So right now you have, the major conferences that continue to invest in the sport, which are really being led, of course, by the Big Ten and the SEC. And when you factor in, the schools that are going to be joining those conferences in 24, even more so. They're really like two giant conferences, but that doesn't take anything away from what conferences like the Big 12 have done in terms of investing in the sport as well. And from when I talk to athletic directors about it, it's a sport that they're generally all excited about and want to invest in and see that return possible for that investment. And I think something that I just hear from athletic directors when we get into the space, and from the executive search firms who are now handling volleyball searches, is that they feel like a smaller investment in a sport like volleyball or women's basketball, but in women's sports, a smaller investment can have multiple times more return than that same investment would have in football or men's basketball. So that's a really interesting way to look at the potential value of having a really successful women's volleyball program, or probably any women's sport program. And if schools continue to take that approach, then I think you'll probably see a bunch of women's sports, volleyball, softball, soccer, continue to grow and increase their level of investment, participation, and rate of return for the school.
When you say a smaller investment, is that a juxtaposition against what they invested before? A smaller investment?
No, when I say smaller investment, I just mean we'll just make up numbers, right? If you take $100K and you want to put that into your softball budget, right? It will probably, from what I have been told, it will probably allow you to do more thing and make a much longer leap forward in a softball program than maybe that $100K would in a football or a men's basketball.
Okay. So it's worth it. Let's do it.
I hope so.
Yeah, right.
I hope so.
What I wonder is, my brain thinks in like simple logical terms, right? If attendance and viewership are up, and if we're talking about eyes, more ad revenue. Now, I don't know if it still works in that linear way anymore in terms of media, but
yeah, I think, not to jump into an area that I am not involved in the conversations about, but it's no secret that on the women's basketball side, there's been a big push in the last year or two for the NCAA to sell that tournament separately. And what that will do, from my readings, again, I'm not in these discussions, but is really advance the amount of money that schools are receiving from that tournament. And it couldn't be happening at a better time, just with the ridiculous star power in the sport right now. I think there's also a hope from volleyball. I imagine softball with the Women's Softball World Series that, as more and more advertisers want to get into women's sports, that can benefit everybody. And if on the NCAA side, that starts with selling some of these tournaments separately, I can see perhaps the negative for some of the other tournaments that may not be as in demand. But for the work that the coaches are doing, which ultimately is what I care about, to advance their sport, I think that it's a great thing that opportunity could be there in the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, it's economics, right? Supply and demand, right? More eyes, more viewership, so more ad revenue. And I wonder, coming back to what you do, if a coach is transitioning, has proven to be at a, for the lack of a better word, smaller school, but everybody's in attendance and people are watching, and now they have an opportunity at a school that's bigger. Is this part of the value that coach brings?
Sure. I think, there's a story that I was told when I started representing women's basketball coaches, which was how Muffet McGraw built the Notre Dame program. And, people saw it when she was winning national championships and towards the end of her career where, I don't know if it's still called the Joyce Center at Notre Dame, but it was, sold out and the attendance was great. It's one of the best programs in the country. But she started by being boots on the ground and going to local organizations and groups and trying to generate support. I think that when you're an athletic director, it certainly behooves you to look at the head coaches who have built not just a program, but built a culture, built a fan base, built a following, and then apply that to the opportunity that you have before you. And from there, determine what is possible with that leader.
Yeah.
So I think that a lot of coaches in all sports, right? Because football, it's important to get out with donors in the community. All sports at the collegiate level, that's a really important part. But yeah, I think that, on the women's sports side generally, that's been a huge, huge component of building support for your program is what are you doing in the community? And that's something with the coaches I work with that we really prepare for, both from an interview standpoint, but then also when you get there, making sure you have that support as you build it.
Ask a couple questions, then we'll wrap. Thinking about a coach brings you on and they have an opportunity. Tell me about the process. Like what is the start of the conversation with the other side, right?
Yeah, so in today's day and age, the job opens and, I'm either going to know somebody at that school or I'm going to know somebody who knows somebody at that school. So my job first and foremost is to get as much information about the opportunity as possible. Today in the sports that I work in, there's a lot of search firm involvement. That business model has shifted a lot since I started. And, it was rare that a women's basketball search would have a executive search firm working on it. Today, it's kind of the norm, or at least 50-50. But anyways, get as much information as I can about that search. I'll then share that with any client of mine who has either expressed interest in that job or who, through our discussions of what their goals are, that job matches what it is they want to be doing. And then from there, we'll decide whether we go after it. So my one rule, as any coach I work with will tell you, is we don't go 50% on any of it. It can be a common thing to hear, hey, why don't we just toss my name in there and see what happens? It's not a great plan.
We're going after it.
Right. So we're going to do it. So anyways, usually from the school's perspective, the order of operations is pretty much the same, which is, either phone or Zoom interview, then bring people to campus. And, not to give away the secret sauce if there is one, but we're just doing whatever we can to put the coach in the best position possible to first get notice and then make sure that they can impress through each of those steps. And we'll use references, we'll use, conversations. I always say that I want to do a holistic review of any opportunity. So it's got to be more than just, what's the contract, right? How many years, how much money? What's the leadership like? That's the biggest evaluation for me today is, who's the athletic director? Who's the sport administrator? What's the history of the program? Have coaches been successful and moved on and or retired, or have they faltered for some time? And if it's the latter, why is that happening? Is it just that it was bad coaches before them, or are there some institutional issues at play? And if it's institutional, then it's my job to also find out, how is the school supporting the program beyond just replacing the coach? Yeah. And it might just be replacing the coach. And ultimately, if that's still an opportunity that a client of mine is interested in, then it's not like we wash our hands of it and say, good luck to you. We're going to make sure it's the best opportunity it can be. But I want any coach that I work with to go into any opportunity eyes wide open. And through the years, I think we've been able to do that where clients have taken on, very challenging jobs. Mm-hmm. But they haven't been surprised by the job when they get in there. And I think that's important.
When you start talking about numbers and contracts and those types of things, that is a process for some of us who may be listening to this podcast. You don't know other than job interviews and then they make an offer, right? That's the only part of it we know. But in terms of you sitting down with them, does the institution say, okay, here's what we're willing? Is it the same as a job interview, in-person interview type process? Or is it you propose, this is what the value is for similar schools with someone who has this track record? Or tell me about how that works.
It really varies on the school and how forthcoming they want to be. There are definitely schools that from the outset will say, here's our pay range. They'll also do that through the search firm they may be using. I think additionally, when a school says that they're interested in a certain coach, they have a pretty good idea of what that coach is currently making from a ballpark. So, have there been times where schools should know that and we get to the finish line and the offer comes and it's a little bit puzzling as to, sure. But for the most part, everybody's a pro in terms of what they do. And that information is readily known. The schools have software, especially if their coach is coming from a public school, that'll tell them this. And, from my perspective, in terms of what I do, I think anybody who does what I do probably has some type of database where they're putting in the work to get contracts from schools that they don't represent the coach at so that they know what people are getting paid and can use that as a basis to slot what it is we're asking for.
Yeah, which is interesting. last question here, then we can wrap. At what point, if I'm an athletics administrator, if I'm an assistant coach, women's basketball, volleyball, any sport really, at what point should I consider engaging with a coaching agent?
Right now.
Really?
Now, at what point, what I ask anybody who reaches out to me or who I meet with at, a convention is, what do you want from an agent? And there are definitely people who think that if you decide to work with an agent, you're going to get a new job. And if they feel that it's that straightforward, I sound like every other agent right now who does talks like this. Like, it's not going to work because there's no guarantee and there's no science to hiring probably anywhere, but certainly in our business.
Right.
So, if you're in a position of leverage, if you feel like you have done a great job and you know that there's about to be a conversation about your contract and your value, I think it's a great time. If you've done well and you feel like you may be ready for a change, I think it's a great time. If you are building a program and you're experiencing challenges from your athletic department or your student athletes, or there's just a lot going on, I think it's a great time. So often agents, I think, are just thought of as money, jobs, contracts. But what I do, that's only part of it. We want to help a coach with whatever they have going on in their career at any time. And today, especially in the last 3 years, coaches have been asked to be so much more than just coaches. They've been asked to be, mental health experts. They've been asked to be epidemiologists. They've been asked, so much is required of being a head coach specifically, with the caveat being that if you screw up, it can really cost you.
Right.
So when we talk about protecting the coaches that I work with, it's not just about their contract. Yeah, we're going to make sure that's as ironclad as it can be, but I also want to be talking to them regularly about what's going on with them within their program, so that if there are any red flags, we can nip it in the bud early, and make sure that they're able to continue to coach without issues until the day they retire.
Yeah, so really providing counsel, right? It's much more than just...
That's where the attorney part helps.
That's where the attorney part comes in. Well, Garry, this has been an excellent conversation. I really appreciate you joining us here on the One Question Leadership Podcast.
Me too. Thanks.
Yes, sir. That was Garry Rosenfield. Garry is an attorney and coaches agent at Coaches Inc. And of course, I am Ty Brown with One Question. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of the One Question Leadership Podcast is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.